Hey everyone, I hope you've been doing well. I hope you and your family are staying safe and healthy in this difficult time. If you have already read this week's handout for listening assignment week 2, you probably don't need to be watching this unless you are just confused on something. But I'm basically just going to be going over that same information. When you are playing an instrument, there are. Sorry, I had to move some laptops. When you're playing an instrument, one of the most important things to think about is how you start a note. Musicians call this the front of the note, the articulation, the attack, along with several other different things. This determines your sound, your volume, your style. A lot of different things are decided with how you start, even just the very first note, but really how you start any note when you're performing. Articulations, as they're called, are marked in music with several different symbols, and today we're going to be going over five basic ones. So, for our first one, we have staccato. Staccatos are notated with a little dot just above or below the note. Traditionally, they tell you to perform the note at half of its written value. So, if you had a 4 beat whole note with a staccato on top of it, you would play the equivalent of a half note, which is only 2 beats. Oftentimes we don't go that far and do all the math like, oh, what's half of a 16th note, blah, blah, blah. We just think of the notes as being shorter. However, some musicians, when they just think short, get really kind of clippy when they play, and there's not really a lot of tone. And again, when we talk about articulation, we're talking about how it affects your sound. So I like to think about playing my staccatos when I perform as light or buoyant. Buoyant being like something that floats in the ocean. This helps keep the notes shorter while still getting that same kind of tone. To, 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 to. There's still that separation, um, but I'm also getting good sound and a good light articulation on every single note. Staccato is very hard to perform on some instruments because of its necessity to keep light and short, including instruments that use a lot of air like the flute or the tuba. It's also the kind of the direct opposite of our second articulation, which is tenuto. Tenutos are notated with a line above or below the note head. Uh, and a tenuto really is just asking you to play the note as it's written to its 100% full value. If I'm giving you a quarter note, I want to hear the whole beat of that quarter note if it has a tenuto on it. Uh, Given this, most notes actually default to tenuto. You want a good full length note that goes all the way to the rest or all the way to the end of the piece. However, if you're coming off of a lot of short, fast notes, somewhere that had a lot of rests, or if you're in a style that maybe doesn't want full length notes all the time, the composer may put a tenuto just to be absolutely clear that he or she wants that note to be absolutely full length. Tenutos are still tongued with a nice T or a ta articulation, though. So even though it's a long note, it is still a firm tongue. Ta, 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 ta. Our third type of articulation is accents. Accents are notated with this little alligator mouth like symbol that either goes above or below the note. All of our articulation markings go above or below the note. You'll never see them like next to it or underneath the music or at the top of the page or anything like that. They're just right there with the note. Uh, Accents are performed with a strong front and a firm articulation. So there's going to be this little like kind of burst of sound at the beginning, then it almost kind of backs off. It very much follows that shape. Strong beginning and then gets a little bit smaller as we go. Um, in most styles of music, including pretty much anything that we do in band, accents are going to be played with a slightly shorter duration, which means they're not as long as a tenuto note. They're not going to be as short of a staccato or as a staccato, but if you add just that little bit of space between the two of them, it really creates a much stronger front on those notes. Ta, 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 ta. It just helps with kind of the drama of it. Our fourth type of articulation is called a legato. Legatos are often referred to simply as slurs, because with most instruments, or if you're singing, or if anything like that, and you see a legato marking, which is just a arc connecting one or two or multiple notes, um, then what the composer wants you to do is to not tongue at all. And so if you're playing an instrument, you would just push the next buttons. D, singing, it would sound just like that. There'd be no break. There'd be no D, 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 D. Um, and you would use that kind of syllable if you had to tongue. Uh, because there is something that we call the legato tongue or legato tonguing. If you're ever in a situation where you have those big slur marks, but you have to repeat the same note. You have to re-articulate that note still. Otherwise, it's just going to sound like one big long note. But you don't want to go slur, 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 ta, slur, slur, slur. That just sounds kind of funny. So you typically use a D or a da articulation. It's a little softer. Da 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 da. Legato articulation is super important for trombone players in specific because with their instruments, if they just try to go between notes on a slur, there's a chance that their instrument is just going to go. It's kind of an ugly sound. It can be fun, but everyone needs legato tonguing once in a while. But there are some instruments that it's particularly important on. Our fifth and final type of articulation is marcato. And marcato are probably the trickiest and the rarest of our five, which is why we saved them for the last. They're typically marked with some type of point on top or below them, and we actually refer to this often as a house top. So a marcato or a marcato accent or a house top accent is tricky because it can mean a lot of different things depending on where you see it. A marcato in a piece by Mozart would not be performed the same as a marcato in a piece by Billie Eilish or Lil Nas or some musician that we listen to today. Marcatos changed with the style. All articulations do, but it's especially true with our marcatos. Typically, however, the general way we agree on it is to perform these somewhat short and somewhat strong. And so it's really kind of like a combination of our staccato and our accent. Um, Short and strong. They are very common in jazz, rock and roll, and pop music. And so, as you're doing your assignment, if you're having a difficult time hearing the difference between a marcato, an accent, and a staccato, really listen for if it sounds kind of jazzy, kind of rock and roll esque. That is probably a good sign that that is a marcato accent. So anyway, guys, I hope you learned something or this reviewed something for you or helped you understand something you didn't understand before about how music, how the little details in music about how even starting a note can be so important for performing and for listening alike. As I said before, I hope you're staying home. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you and your family are doing well. And I love you guys, and I miss you, and I hope to see you soon.